3. MV Trade Daring. Built in 1972, the 873-foot-long MV Trade Daring was a Cypriot-owned tanker that transported raw materials around the world. The ship was bound for France, but never reached its destination. It crushed under the weight of its load and broke in half on November 11, 1994, while being loaded with manganese ore at Ponta do Madeira in Brazil. A few months later, in early 1995, the two halves of the Trade Daring were scuttled at sea. It's uncommon but not unheard of for large ships to break in half. In 2021, for example, the 656-foot-long cargo ship Crimson Polaris ran aground and snapped in two near the northern Japanese port of Hachinohe. The Panamanian flag vessel was nearing its final destination with a load of wood chips from Thailand when strong winds blew it into the shallow waters where it got stuck. A 3-mile-long oil slick trailed behind it as it lost part of its cargo. Luckily, all 21 crew members aboard were safely rescued. The stern sank and the remaining front section was towed to port. In yet another shocking example of an enormous ship breaking in half, the 1,037-foot-long Japanese-built container ship MOL Comfort broke in two while en route from Singapore to Jeddah in 2013. The vessel suffered a crack amid bad weather, roughly 230 miles off the Yemeni coast, and gave way to hogging, which happens when a ship's beam is curved upward. All 26 crew members were rescued by nearby container ships. Surprisingly, the two halves of the Comfort initially remained afloat, with most of the 4,382 cargo containers intact. A salvage mission was undertaken in an attempt to tow the sections to safety. The stern section took on water and sank 13,000 feet to the seafloor before the operation to save it could begin. It only took a few minutes for it to slip beneath the waves, scattering cargo containers that soon followed to their watery grave. Meanwhile, 4 tugboats began towing the bow section, but soon began running into problems. First, the tow line broke free during bad weather. It was reattached, and the effort resumed until a few days later, when a fire broke out in the rear of the bow section. The tugboats requested help from the Indian Coast Guard as they battled to get the blaze under control in bad weather, but nearly all the cargo containers were destroyed. Any cargo that remained intact was never salvaged, but instead came down with the half ship and came to rest at a depth of 9,800 feet. While lost cargo amounts to a lot of money down the drain, the most important priority when it comes to a ship in distress is to save as many human lives as possible. The crews of the Trade Daring, Crimson Polaris, and MOL Comfort were lucky to emerge from the wrecks unscathed. It doesn't always turn out that way, as the crew of the engineering vessel Fujing 001 learned in 2022. The 670-foot-long ship's 30 crew members were working on an offshore wind project off the Hong Kong coast when they got caught up in Typhoon Chaba. The Fujing 001 broke in half and started to sink as crew members called for rescue. Unfortunately, strong winds and waves prevented emergency responders from reaching the vessel. A helicopter arrived just before it went under and managed to save 4 crew members. The rescue mission soon became a recovery effort. 12 bodies were found, while the remaining 14 crew members were presumed dead. Do you think you could ever work on a boat for weeks or months at a time? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. Exxon Valdez oil spill. The 988-foot-long supertanker Exxon Valdez was en route to Long Beach, California with 53 million gallons of crude oil in 1989 when it ran aground in Prince William Sound, Alaska. It struck a well-known navigational hazard called Bligh Reef just minutes after midnight on March 24th, tearing the ship's hull and causing millions of gallons of crude oil to spill into the water. Authorities rushed to try containing the spill, but initially failed to get it under control. Over the following months, the oil slick continued to spread, eventually covering around 1,300 miles of coastline. The remote location of the spill was only accessible by boat, plane, or helicopter, complicating the response to the disaster. A multi-billion-dollar cleanup effort was undertaken by federal responders, Exxon employees, and more than 11,000 Alaska residents. Workers rescued and cleaned animals, skimmed oil from the water's surface, sprayed oil dispersant chemicals which break oil down into small droplets and make it easier to clean, and sprayed oil-covered beaches with hot water. Despite the dedicated efforts to clean up the spill as quickly as possible, the disaster wreaked havoc on the region's wildlife, killing an estimated 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 otters, 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, and 22 orcas. It's also believed that the spill contributed to the collapse of the salmon and herring industries in Prince William Sound during the early 1990s. As of 2001, lingering oil contamination was found at dozens of sites along the shoreline. To this day, the herring population has failed to recover, and it took 25 years before the region's seal population recovered to its pre-spill levels in 2014. An investigation found that third mate Gregory Cousins was at the helm when the Exxon Valdez ran aground. He was unlicensed to steer the ship and failed to return to the proper shipping lane after diverting around some icebergs, at which point the crash occurred. Captain Joseph Hazelwood was in his stateroom at the time of the accident. He admitted to having drunk 2 or 3 vodkas at least 6 hours before the crash and was accused of being drunk when it happened. Until then, Hazelwood had a pristine track record as a ship captain. He became the youngest Exxon captain in 1978 at age 32. In 1985, he successfully guided an asphalt carrier to safety during harsh weather, sparing the crew from having to abandon ship. But the captain struggled with alcohol abuse. His driver's license was suspended or revoked 3 times in the state of New York for alcohol-related incidents starting in 1984. In 1985, he went to rehab and then started attending Alcoholics Anonymous. But Hazelwood fell off the wagon again in 1988 when he caught a DUI charge. His driver's license was suspended at the time of the accident. Despite Hazelwood's troubled history with alcohol, prosecutors failed to convince the court that he was intoxicated when the crash occurred, and he was acquitted of any alcohol-related charges. He was convicted of misdemeanor negligence and fined $50,000 and was also ordered to perform 1,000 hours of community service. Exxon fired Hazelwood, and he spent 8 years appealing his conviction before he finally gave up the fight and started his community service. A few months after the spill, the Exxon Valdez was towed to San Diego for repairs. At one point, Exxon tried returning the vessel to its North American fleet, but it was soon banned from operating in US waters. It operated under various names in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, before being removed from service in 2002 when the European Union banned single-hulled oil tankers. In 2008, a Hong Kong-based shipping company bought the vessel, converted it into an ore carrier, and renamed it the Dongfang Ocean. It was scrapped 4 years later in 2012. The disaster influenced the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which imposed harsher penalties on companies that are found responsible for oil spills. It also requires all oil tankers in the US to be double-hulled, which is why the Exxon Valdez could no longer operate in the country even after it was repaired. Hazelwood finally apologized for the disaster in 2009, specifically extending his remorse to the people of Alaska. But he said that the truth about what really happened is out there, implying that he doesn't believe he's at fault for the accident, and he claimed that the reason the facts weren't widely reported was because they made the story far less juicy than the narrative the media chose to put forth. Although his master's license remains valid to this day, he struggled to secure any sort of long-term work as a ship captain. The Exxon Valdez disaster was the largest oil spill in US history until the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. While drilling an exploratory well 18,360 feet below sea level, the British Petroleum-operated semi-submersible drilling rig hit methane and exploded, engulfing the platform in flames. A 3-day search failed to recover 11 missing workers, and 94 others were rescued. The Deepwater Horizon sank 2 days later. It took months and numerous attempts to contain the continuous stream of oil that spewed into the ocean, darkening the water and staining beaches. Several months after the disaster, the well was declared effectively dead, but it was found to still be leaking in 2012. The spill ravaged wildlife, causing baby dolphins to die at 6 times the normal rate and wreaking havoc on fish populations. In 2016, BP was ordered to pay nearly $21 billion in fines in the largest corporate settlement in US history. 1. Cwise Giant. Built in Japan during the late 1970s, the 1,504-foot-long supertanker TT Cwise Giant was the longest ship ever made, measuring nearly twice the length of the ill-fated RMS Titanic. At 225 feet wide and weighing in at over 621,703 tons, she was also the heaviest self-propelled vessel ever built. Her propeller alone weighed 50 tons, and her rudder weighed 230 tons. The Cwise Giant was too large and heavy to navigate the English Channel, the Suez Canal, or the Panama Canal. By the time it was finished being built, the Greek company that had originally ordered the ship refused to take delivery of it. A lengthy legal battle ensued, and the Japanese shipyard where the vessel was built won the rights to sell it. After launching in 1981 under a Hong Kong-based company, the ship made routine runs between the Middle East and the United States. She enjoyed a relatively uneventful career until the Iran-Iraq War in 1988, when the Iraqi Air Force bombed the vessel off Larak Island in the Strait of Hormuz. It caught fire and sank, and was declared a total loss. The following year, the Norwegian consortium Norman International bought the wreck and towed it to Singapore, where it underwent repairs for 2 years. During that time, the Cwise Giant was renamed the Happy Giant. Once the repairs were finished, Norwegian shipping mogul Jørgen Jara bought the ship for $39 million and renamed it yet again, this time calling it the Jara Viking. It sailed under the Norwegian flag for 13 years before its owner decided that it was becoming impractical and costly to run such a big vessel. And not to mention that it was a pain to navigate. In addition to having to use extreme caution to avoid running aground in places that smaller ships pass through with ease, it took 5 miles for the Jara Viking to come to a stop from its full speed. In 2004, the massive ship was converted into a permanently moored storage tanker called the Nok Nevis. For the next 5 years, it sat in the Qatar Al Shaheen oil field in the Persian Gulf. After outliving its usefulness as a storage vessel, the Nok Nevis was renamed once more as the Mont. In 2010, it was towed on its final voyage to the Alang shipbreaking yard in India, where an estimated 18,000 workers spent a year dismantling it. The ship's 40-ton anchor was saved and given to the Hong Kong Maritime Museum as the only surviving relic of the monstrous vessel. In terms of gross tonnage, the 1,056-foot-long Stella Daisy was the largest ship to ever be lost at sea. Launched in 1993, the Japanese-built vessel originally operated as an oil carrier, before laws requiring double-hulled vessels led to it being repurposed as an ore carrier. It operated in this capacity under the ownership of a South Korean company from 2008 to 2017, when something exploded on the ship and caused it to start taking on water. The Stella Daisy was en route from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil to China when the disaster occurred. It began to list heavily and sank 1,500 miles off the Brazilian coast very shortly after the crew radioed for help. 2 crew members were rescued from a life raft. When an extensive search failed to find the remaining 22 crew members, they were presumed dead. Human remains belonging to at least 1 person were found near the wreck in 2019. The cause of the disaster remains a mystery to this day, but experts have speculated that it was likely related to the ship's conversion from an oil tanker to an ore carrier. Thanks for watching. Have you ever visited a shipwreck before? Tell us about it in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.